Okay, here we are. It's very nice to see you, Huw. I'm here with Huw Lloyd, and welcome to whatever this is. Welcome to this conversation.
Thank you.
And it's really good to see you. I've been interested in reading various pieces of your writing for a fair amount of time now. And recently you posted a long video response to a question of mine. And how was that? How was that for you? What was that like?
Yeah, interesting experience. I hadn't done a video of that length, so I was happy with how it came through. I think David Kellogg mentioned, these things that you don't realize, that your own habits that come back to you a bit more clearer than you're otherwise aware of. So that's quite interesting too. So yeah.
Anything in particular?
Oh, things like things like so I'm working on that. I'm working on that one. So
that's nice. That's nice. I'm not. I can't polish myself up anymore. There's only so good it can get. So we talked, mainly you talked, but I was asking you on camera and then offline about parenting quite a bit. But I'd like this conversation to be a little more wide ranging. That's okay with you.
Mm-hmm.
So, but since you asked me offline, I'll answer you now. Part of my interest in studying Vygotsky and this haphazard project is I want to get closer to the bottom of this puzzle because I don't have a psychology background. I'm a teacher. I used to teach high school English. Now I teach middle school English. So I've encountered Vygotsky through, I guess, educational psychology loosely. And about 10 years ago, I just started getting interested in it.
Okay.
I was studying it a little bit in college and then took some time off. And then I'm just trying to get a little closer to actually understanding this. So
yeah, great. So that
you might relate no matter how many times people talk about the same concept over and over again. It's like it gets a little richer each time.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Well, I think, well, personally for me, these are concepts that go, that are quite deep, and they're insightful, and they can enrich the way you do things, perhaps enrich your life. So yeah, I mean, if you're a thoughtful person, then you're going to enjoy it, I'd have thought. So, but I didn't realize you'd been reading around Vygotsky for that sort of duration. So wow, were you introduced to Vygotsky through teaching? Then is that how you first?
Yes, when I was first training to be a teacher, his was the name that was thrown around. Obviously, the concept of ZPD in its elementary form was introduced to us, and but then once I tried reading Thinking in Speech and some other primary sources, I was just totally over my head. I mean, it would take me an hour to read 4 or 5 pages, and it was really slow going.
Okay.
And now I'm up to maybe 7 pages in an hour.
That's probably pretty good, actually. Yeah. Yeah. Likewise, I find myself, I'm quite a slow reader. Compared to my wife, who speeds through things, and I whether it's true or not, I put it down to saying, well, I'm just doing a lot of thinking when I'm reading, so I don't know if it's thoughtful,
Yeah.
So
I do a lot of squinting and because I don't have a lot of the references. I don't really have much of a psychology background.
Okay. Yes.
So a fair amount of the references are, I have to get guesswork, and after a while, so this video thing that I started doing was kind of haphazard. One question I had was, can I develop enough knowledge, enough understanding, enough semi-expertise in this field for it to be useful to myself and maybe others as a teacher, practically, very pragmatically, when I know full well, because I interact with some of these people, you could study this for a lifetime, start to almost develop an expertise. And I'm like, can I take a shortcut? You know, can I learn this stuff on the cheap?
Yeah. Mm.
And I am somewhat of a slow reader, so these conversations have been one method for me to try to. I guess I'm trying to maybe stand as a bridge between the person who doesn't want to commit any time and the person who wants to commit a
Yeah.
lifetime. So that's my
Yeah.
goal.
I think there are very good advantages, but there are some disadvantages perhaps, or just consequences too,
Yeah.
of trying to go, you know, directly or mediated through other people's understandings, because of course, as you no doubt aware from reading messages, and different people have different understandings of the content, or come at it from quite significantly different ways. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. How did you arrive here in terms of the Vygotsky stuff?
Well, similarly to yourself, I had conceptual problems that I was trying to resolve, and I thought I detected some clues in Vygotsky's writing, as well as some other psychology texts, and I write about this a little bit in some of my draft papers. So basically the problem I was trying to get to at the time was turned out to be resolved through my understandings of active orientation. But it started in the late 90s, where it started as it was a clearly formed, well, a reasonably clearly formed problem for me in the late 90s, after doing some cognitive science studies. It was a master's program, and it was interesting, but I didn't agree with much of the deeper side to it.
And I'm gonna jump in. I'm gonna jump in very briefly.
That's fine.
What is cognitive science in a very simple terms?
Oh gosh,
if that's possible. Sometimes I do this. I ask a very simple question that's kind of hard to answer. But what's the basic gist?
Well, I'm not sure if this is a definition that your classic cognitive scientist would give you, but now I would say that you could say cognition is the guiding aspect of activity, you could say. So if you need to do any, you know, you're doing a task and you want to think about aspects of that task, then you could call that's the cognitive aspects of it. A cognitive scientist would probably come up with something, you know, in terms of the old school cognitive science that I was encountering, would probably feature something about information processing and that sort of thing in there. But basically, I would say any activity the guiding aspect of activities. Now that, or the conscious guiding aspect is probably more accurate, because if you're undertaking a familiar activity, you know, if you're making yourself a cup of tea or coffee or something, then you don't necessarily need to be aware of what you're doing. You know, it's just habitual. Your mind will be on something else probably, and in that sense, there isn't a lot of cognition going on. But you could take many very habitual activities and deliberately pay attention to them, in which case there would be more conscious activity going on. Okay, so cognition in that sense is, I would say, basically the thinking side of activity, which means the guiding aspects, because that's the role of thought, is to guide our activity. Does that make sense to you?
It does. And I have a couple questions that I'm going to put on hold, because I want to allow you to get back to your original story, which was, I guess you were kind of taking an information processing approach, and you found some gaps there that were unsatisfying.
Yeah. Oh, well, it was almost I was coming into encounter. I mean, as a young adult, you have to find your way in the world, understand what's going on, come to appreciate some of the more deeper aspects of your culture, and how how that culture works. And I think part of that, you know, you're trying to work out how things work, basically. It seemed to me at the time that there were some problems with that, that the way people were construing certain activities was incomplete and missing very important aspects, which were also for me very interesting aspects. And so the thing that was basically missing for me in the studies of cognitive science was what I eventually came to understand as active orientation, which basically adds a whole extra dimension to cognition, a much more refined, interesting structure, and not something that's just like a computational model or something that you can apply. So yeah. So basically, I was experiencing, you know, it was an area that was interesting for me, but it was something that I just to pursue that interesting topic in the form that it was presented within the academic settings that I was finding would have been completely unsatisfactory, because you're basically throwing away everything that was rich and interesting for you in the process of trying to, you know, study this informally. So for a very long time, I continued my studies, my interests, in parallel with lots of different work, a lot of systems work, a lot of programming and software and analysis work. And eventually I came to hit upon ways to resolve that problem, which were interesting in itself. And and I've developed that since then. So yeah.
Was the problem some sort of like coldness, or some sort of lack of humanity or something, or some sort of like mechanistic element?
Yeah, to a certain extent it was. I mean, to use other words, a large part of it was to bring perspective into the role of cognition. But that isn't really doing it justice, because there's the in the moment subjective orientation to something. It's a whole synthesis of ways of being, ways of looking, ways of understanding. And I think another example that, for example, there are lots of little puzzles that didn't fit with the cognitive model that I was encountering originally. For example, what is intuition? Okay. Now, because intuition happens without what you would call thinking in a calculating kind of manner. You can solve a problem by doing arithmetic or arithmetic-like thinking, or work through something, but intuition doesn't happen that way. And my slowly piecing together this way of thinking about active orientation was, for example, for me a good answer to that aspect. So the intuition would just be one small. Well, intuition itself isn't small, but it was a small part of the jigsaw of the problem that I was experiencing. And so for me at the time, there was it's a very interesting subject for me, but the way it was being approached was unsatisfying. And so I was trying to find a way to actually get at this stuff. So as with many things in terms of understanding, you're at the same time as you are coming to a better insight into what it is that's the problem, you're at the same time better understanding the nature of the problem, if you get my gist.
And
Yes.
sometimes the closer you get to the details, the more you could see the cracks in the structure somewhat.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
the light, you could see the light that's getting in as you get closer to it.
Um,
I have a different question though that's related.
mhm.
Did you throw the puzzle out altogether, or did you maintain the puzzle and find new pieces that were missing? Did you create a new puzzle? Does that question
No,
make any sense?
yeah, well,
Because I find that people often tend to like just like wipe the whole table clean, when they get frustrated, and
oh,
get rid of
uh,
the puzzle that was there and try to start from scratch.
right. No, I try to keep my goalposts stuck, stay with them. And for me, it wasn't like a personal hobby or interest. I mean, yeah, sure, very, it was more an enthusiasm, a joy for this particular area, but finding that it just didn't fit with my personal experience, the way I understood things, or just a satisfying way of explanation. And so that involved a fair amount of
As
reading
opposed
around.
to active orientation, which I would like, if you can you give me a sort of starter overview? Which might not be your preference, but I'm going to kind of ask for like give me the starter, and then we'll go from there.
Well, there's different ways to come at it. One is just to say it's like perspective, but it's more than, it's a whole mental and bodily active orientation. You could say at any particular time you have a certain disposition, right? So if you are driving your car, or assuming you have a car to drive, if you're driving, then your attention is on certain things, you're looking out for certain things, your body is moving in certain ways and has certain configurations, okay? So you yourself, you could look at it in terms of functional systems and think of your body as this very elaborate um, um, uh, very elaborate system of interconnected parts that can move in different ways, and you can think about different things at different times. But in particular activities, you don't want too much variety. You want to focus on what's important at the time, and otherwise you're not going to be able to deal with the situation. Okay, you're going to be distracted. So in any particular activity, you're going to be focused on particular things, and when events arise, you're going to, if an event arises that requires a quick response, then you'll be ready to. For example, if you're driving along and see the traffic lights change, you want to slow down in time and not go through the traffic lights. So that perhaps is a nice example where we can say that you see something ostensibly in the outside world, you see something and you say, okay, that light has turned from green to amber or even to red, and that means something to you in that context, right? But in a different context, a change of color might not mean that to you at all, okay? Now in the traffic light situation, it's designed almost to just have to be one context effectively. But there are many situations where an event could have different meanings to you depending upon how you look at it, your orientation to it, okay? So as that might be a nice simple way to at least see the point of it, is to say that, well, that it's giving a contextual interpretation to events, but not just cognitive or perceptual, but to your readiness to act and perform. Now this relates to for example, activity theory, Leontief, in a very close way, because Leontief talks about activity, and he talks about I will call it the task of activity, just to avoid confusion, because some people will call it the object of activity, which is it's fine to use, but you need to be clear about what you mean by object. But so when you have a task in your activity and it's something you're engaged in, okay, there are certain things you're attending to and certain things that you aren't. Okay. So does that help?
Yeah, so it sounds like it's a combination of sort of mind and body attention, sign reading, like some signs are quite predictable for you as an individual and also culturally, like street signs and street lights. But signs are kind of everywhere. Like sometimes lights are changing from red to yellow to green, metaphorically speaking, and we might not necessarily pick up on such signs. And that maybe this is a type of maybe like mind body mindfulness system in a way.
Yeah. I mean, if you need to make the distinction, sometimes is relevant. I mean, the first thing, I mean, I'd come back to a lot of all these psychological studies, is that when people talk about certain phenomena, or they come up with terms, this is just, most of the time, it's just drawing a distinction around something and saying this is, this is interesting. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only way to construe it. Do you see what I mean? You can look at something, for example, a piece of furniture, and a reasonably naive way to look at it and saying, yeah, that's a separate thing. It is chair, it is chairness, all right. But you can equally look at this and say, well, at what point is the chair not a chair, right? If you take off one of the chair's legs, is it a chair? Okay. You can draw boundaries around things and say, realize that what you label something, you do because it's useful, right? The labels are there because for someone at some point in time, it's a useful distinction. And so and the same applies to all the particular terms in psychology. They're used because they're useful. And active orientation for me was a very useful idea and conception to work upon, that for me unlocked all those problems and helped me to then formalize better the kinds of interests and things that I wanted to pursue. So
in any respect, is active orientation a what's the word I'm looking for? Is it a practice, or is it more of like a concept?
Well, it can be. I mean, I would say for sure, if you
for
study,
you, and also is it for you a practice at all?
Well, it is, but I didn't realize it. For me, I was just interested in the subject, but then inadvertently, you can recognize that by studying active orientation in your own activity and others, you become more self-aware, and so you can look at it as an exercise in self-awareness, self-consciousness, in that sense. So yes, in that sense, it is.
Is this something that you can imagine being useful for me in a classroom as a teacher, or even as a learner, or even as a teacher
definitely.
slash learner?
I would expect parents and teachers are aware of this, of the web, but they just might not put a word on it or a term to it. Yeah. So
we use a lot of metacognitive type terminology.
Okay.
And where I come from, so I'm not sure if that's similar, but it feels like maybe it's a cousin, if not a brother.
Well, if you're aware of your own orientation, then you could say that's metacognitive for sure. Yes, but where I say like teachers should probably be aware of this anyway, as well as parents, or is it saying, for example, if you set the class to undertake a task, okay, you may become aware that some children are undertaking that task with a great deal of engagement and interest, and others might be just going through the motions. Okay. Now you'll be also aware that that has consequences for their understanding, right? If you're really engaged in the task, the way you understand and the nature, for example, even your memory for that activity will be different. Okay. So there would be different consequences for that. Now, as a teacher or parent, what is it that's telling you that one child is engaged in the activity and one child is sort of pretending to do the activity, or is doing it but not really paying attention to what they're doing? What's telling you that, and why is that an important thing for you as a teacher? Do you see? So in some respects, so this is partly what active orientation is sort of looking at, is just everyday process, personal part of the activity, but it's giving it formal recognition, right? So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was going to ask you, let's say I wanted to make a habitual practice in my classroom. Now, I might do this quietly by myself in my own head. I might do this outwardly as a collective group. But we wanted to make this concept forefront, if only for a moment, just as like a snapping to type thing. Is there like one statement, one or two questions that could be posed habitually, like,
right,
where are you
okay,
now, or something like that?
Okay. Yeah, I suppose you could. I mean, this would be sort of going into the sort of meditative literature or ideas around things, if you wanted to do that. But I mean, I haven't really. For me, the studies that I've done of active orientation have just been about not trying to elicit self-awareness of active orientation, but just to try and show that you can show what the active orientation of a child is in an activity.
Got it.
But if you, yes, I mean, I think it would be a productive thing for children to become, I mean, you know, children often, you know, it's a learning process to achieve this kind of self-awareness. I would probably think something along the lines of, excuse me, along the lines of a question that might help facilitate that. If the question is, if they understand the question, in light of the question is pointing them to think about how they are oriented. I mean, this would be a great thing to introduce into the classroom if you had time, of just if children become very conscious that the way that they undertake their activity has consequences for what they learn. Okay, I would say that, you know, the things as a good thing as a teacher to be aiming for is to encourage children to become aware of how they learn, or what or good ways to learn. And this would be, I think, an important aspect to it, of recognizing that they can orient to things at certain times. I think I touched on this a little bit in the talk I gave before, when I was talking, for example, about towards the end of the day, children
they're beat up, they're pooped.
Getting fussy and things. I don't know if you've experienced that with your own.
For sure, yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, and so you can, you know, from that perspective, you think, okay, you know, to encourage them to be aware that once they start getting tired, to choose something, and that would be an example of that. Now, with children, it might not be the self-awareness. It might just be eventually habitual. They think, oh, it's getting towards the evening time, and they just unconsciously will pick something not so tough to do that they would enjoy doing earlier in the day, perhaps. Yeah, self-awareness of children is quite an interesting.
Yeah, it seems like a good time saver, because if you're not like, let's say your ladder is oriented to the wrong wall. It's the Stephen Covey idea, and you put the ladder on the wrong wall and you climb it, you're getting to the wrong place faster. And
okay.
So it's almost just sort of like a repositioning of the ladder type move. Is helpful. I know for a teacher, I have things I do in my head quietly where I'm like, move the ladder or something, and
okay.
try to save yourself 30 minutes of driving your car into a ravine.
Okay.
Just
for
sort
you
of
personally, or to help the class?
For me personally, but I make that explicit. Like, I tell them, like, that's one of my moves. But something I can elicit. I also can't see into their head. I can't. My children as well. I cannot see inside their skull. So just as a way of getting some sort of feedback in a very maybe quick, reliable, and then habitual way, just as like a way of bringing everybody back to the moment.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much that relates to what you were saying, but it seems like a productive.
Well, yes, I'd say it does. I mean, the big project that I worked on, with respect to active orientation, was studying. So I took a particular activity, which was my one of my boys when he was 4 years old, I think. Well, he had just started school. Okay, so I don't think he was quite young for his year. So he might have been coming up to 5. I can't remember. So he's just starting reception year, and they were going to be starting to learn to write letters and things. So I built up a a lot of experimental data of him attempting letters with an application that I had put together. And the whole point of the project, there's lots of points to it, but one of the aims of the project was try to show his orientation just upon looking at the results of his writing. Okay, so whether you can see that how the major facets of how they're oriented based upon their activity. And this includes not just looking at the final letters that he produced, but particularly it was more the movements of the letters in time. Okay. We're jumping around a little bit here, but one of the things you wanted to talk about, I think, was microgenesis. And so this would be an example of microgenesis in here would be when he's writing a letter. I'll do the letter. So if he's doing an S, this probably looks like a backwards S to you, but he's doing an S. Okay, you could give he can start off with basically what I call corridor. So when you're practicing, you can have sort of a long shape that you draw within, okay, and get used to that guidance. And then you can use simpler forms of guidance, like a few dots around drawing them. But you can study the motion of that drawing. So he'd be using a pen or something probably to draw it, okay. And it won't be smooth, okay, necessarily. I mean, if it's something like an N, when you have something down and you come up and around, particularly when you're learning these things, there's a great deal of structure going into it. But you can basically look at a key facet you can look at is the timing. And so if you have a fluent writing, you have something like this, okay? And it's like one motion. But if you have something where you're learning about how to do this, you might have a movement down, it might be very, very slow, and then coming up, and it might stop and come around. but the fluency of the movement can be used to reveal the guidance that's given to that movement. Basically, you can look at when you slow down or stop, there's more thinking going on.
Yeah.
Okay. So quite simple to explain, but took a lot of effort to set everything up in order to capture that data and show it. And so that's a key thing that I was looking at. So if you can look at the fluency involved in the generation of letters, you can tell how the formation of these letters is guided. You can compare that with the official guidance that's given in producing these. Now, if the child produced that guidance, sorry if I'm skipping around, you don't follow this, right? If the two align, right, then that's telling you something about the self-awareness of the child or their ability to think about the activity that they're doing. Okay, so there's all these clues can come into effectively inferring the strategy that the child undertook in doing the activity. And if you know their strategy, then you know a large amount about how they were oriented to that activity and what they were doing. So all this feeds in to studying things like that. But now,
and then would you want to be influencing their orientation or sort of more observing?
Well, as a teacher, I think you might. Yeah, I mean, as a teacher, I mean, again, for parents.
Well, actually, I was wondering, in that particular experiment, were you sort of trying to stay neutral and just sort of observe and record, or?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I designed that. It was all software driven. I'd written it for a tablet.
How about as a parent in other domains? Are you trying to influence their orientation often? Are you sort of trying to study and recognize it? Do you ever experience any conflicts between the two, or does your attention on this topic help you?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, it's key. It's a key thing. It's a key theme in development. Well, in the kind of developmental education that I've looked into and studied, I would say it's very important. It's very important. In fact, one of the important things is, I would say, not necessarily to be explicit about what the orientation should be. So now, you look at some researchers, even within the Russian tradition, and they will explicitly try and provide a schema and say, this is how you want to orient to these things, which, that's been documented to show very good results. But I would also, my own opinion on this and thinking is that there is a very important skill on the part of the child, or anyone, doesn't have to be a child, to gain fluency in mastering their own orientation and how to construe things, which I would say is a very important part of solving problems, or of doing these things. Is this making sense to you?
Yeah, it's making quite a bit of sense.
Okay, all right.
Now, if let's say you have a child and it's summer, your child doesn't want to read so much.
Okay.
How is this at all potentially helpful? That's a wide open question. Sorry, I could probably make a better question, but I can't think of it yet. And you and your child, maybe to different extents, believe that reading is valuable.
Well, I think to the extent that they agree with that, if they thought that it was important to do, then I think they do it in maybe in their own time or in their own way.
Yeah, that's a really poorly phrased question.
Well, the reason why, one of the reasons why I'm pausing is that what I've said about orientation with respect to saying it's very important developmentally, there are good reasons for that. So it might be worthwhile skipping on to that, and then perhaps coming back to what you're talking about here about trying to encourage particular activities. And so are you happy for me just to go a bit more?
Yeah, I am, and I've been a little undisciplined because I want to be mindful of your time today, and I
Well,
had
it's
a
okay.
couple
I
other
mean, if it's
questions.
useful, yeah, if it's, I don't mind. I don't mind
Yeah,
taking.
but one of my major questions from today is I have not begun to look into Davydov's work or
Right.
developmental education.
Mm-hmm.
Period.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that's where my investigations are going to head, because they kind of have
Okay.
to. They kind of have to, based on where I'm at. So can you give me maybe a little bit of a primer, just to kind of help me before I get started?
All right. Yeah, that's appropriate to what I was suggesting as well. So,
Okay.
So you have to bear in mind that all my familiarity with these researches is via translations, and so you might say it's slightly second-hand accounts. But for me, in any of these studies, I try to make sure that my understandings are coherent. And I think that adds a certain degree of strength to what you come away with. Davydov's writings, well, what I've read of Davydov is like there's some very large papers that are basically book-length papers. I think he wrote on generalization and similar topics, and also a book on developmental education. Feeding into that, there's a large amount of material that's been published by the Journal of Russian and East European Psychology. It's called JREAP, is how I refer to it. And there are many, many papers there that you can read in the context or in the light of Davydov and developmental education. So there's a good amount of material there. What Davydov writes about is substantial. And so with all these contributions, you can come up with quite a coherent understanding. And for Davydov, I would say that the actual core of what Davydov, or what I take it away from Davydov, is quite simple once you get to it. It's quite, but important. Let me just show you the book, and you might help.
Sure.
So if you're an English speaker and you get into Davydov, that's the one to read. But it's not easy to read because half of the book is using terminology from Russian dialectics. And so you will read text that, if you're not familiar with it, you'll think it's very abstract and it's talking about the ideal and, dialectical thinking and language that can be very hard to get through if you're not familiar with it. So, but nevertheless, there's some very good material in here.
Well, let me interject real quick. So my understanding of Vygotsky's cultural historical theory is that it's very much a dialectical theory of development, and I kind of have a pretty good grasp on terms like contradiction and qualitative reorganization and things like that. So somewhat. So that's an update kind of on where I'm at.
Okay, I think there's Vygotsky in respect to language and language used to describe dialectical processes. Vygotsky is probably more readable if you're not familiar with the philosophical terms than, for example, some of the things that Davydov writes, because he's getting into a bit more of a philosophically perhaps problematic area, or it's just the way that he writes, or the way the translators put things. But it's things that, for example, the philosopher Ilyenkov wrote a lot about, and that can be quite hard going if you're not used to that way of writing. But you don't need to really go into that extensively in order to get to the important points, I think, that Davydov has to offer. So an important distinction that Davydov makes is between empirical thinking and theoretical thinking. Okay. Essentially, theoretical thinking is about understanding or appreciation of the strategy or ways of construing and understanding a problem. Okay, so you're sort of understanding what you're doing in the process of doing it. And empirical thinking you could think of as a bit like following sets of rules that someone else has provided for you, but you don't necessarily know why those rules are given. Okay, now in our schooling, or at least in my experience of our schooling and what I've seen, it's nearly all empirical thinking. Okay, so for example, if you're in a mathematics class and you're learning about trigonometry or some similar subject, you'll probably be taught it in a rule-based fashion, right? So the properties of cosine and sine and cos, and you might even be given a little useful way to remember how these come into an equation, all right? And you just might remember a rule of how to put them together. But you haven't necessarily at all come to really come to grips with why these conceptions actually exist, why we use them, why they are referred to in this particular way, okay, why these particular terms are used. You know, for example, as I was talking about, for example, using terms that are useful, if you look at furniture, we have a name for a table and a name for a chair and these things, because we talk about them in relation to each other. So why, for example, do we have cosine and sine and cos and tangent, you know, and other terms? Why those particular terms, and why have we divided up the problem space in that particular way? All these sorts of things you won't get into in conventional teaching, right? You might say, oh, there isn't time, and lots of other reasons why we don't do that. Okay, that's part of so the rule-based learning is you can pretty much translate to being or associate with being about empirical learning, empirical thinking. But that isn't all of it. A key and very important part of developmental education is to have access to mentally, or at least imaginatively, the source of ideas or the reasoning of ideas for things. Okay, and this is an important aspect with respect to Davydov, in that ideally you want to, if you're going to be presenting a lesson on something and you want children to get a sense of the problem, you might say to grok the problem, right? If you want, that's just a bit of slang. If you want to say, yeah, I grok this subject, you're saying more than just, oh yeah, I've got a rule for this. If you're saying I grok this, you're like saying I really get something essential about this. I really get it now, right? And you're saying more than just, oh yeah, I can do arithmetic, I can, you know, I can work with fractions. It's like saying, you know, what fractions are all about, why we use them. Okay.
So part of what I'm hearing from you is there's an emphasis on the development of the learner and the learning environment, but also on the development of the concepts themselves, perhaps even
absolutely,
how these concepts have developed into what they
absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So a key part for if you were designing a lesson or a situation, a good place to start is with the history of ideas. Okay, so if there's an idea, or a concept or an idea that you want to introduce, a good approach to do so would be to think about this historically and work out at what juncture in our cultural history did this idea come about. All right, someone invented this. It's probably an invention. Someone invented this idea.
In response to what? As a solution to what?
In response to a situation. All right. Now this might be a technical invention. Okay. Could have been a bicycle. Could have been, you know, whatever. Everything that we have, you know, a piece of, you know, a bowl, a mug, a knife to cut with, all these things at some point or other were invented. Okay. And they weren't just invented arbitrarily. There was a particular reason for them. Now, this is where the orientation part comes in. If you encounter that problem personally, if you genuinely encounter that problem, then you will be exposed to a rich source of information telling you about the nature of that problem, what's going to work, what isn't, to a certain degree. There's a very rich source of information that you are exposed to in encountering that problem authentically. Okay. And this is where a key part of where the orientation comes in. So developmental education in the Davydovian sense, you could say, is problem oriented. Okay. So problems are good. The problems, you want to design things so that the children encounter problematic material, but in a particular kind of way. I don't mean problematic in that it's of ethical issue or this sort of thing. I mean that it's problem because that they don't necessarily know how to deal with the problem. They have to start engaging thinking, real thinking, to engage it. Now, one of the ways that you can do this,
would you say problem solving is at the forefront in all sorts of different facets?
Yes, but particularly, it's not just problem solving like in terms of how mathematic problems might be presented to a child, which, you know, I do this too, is that saying, well, you just give your child a sum to work out or some elaboration of that. You know, you say, well, what's a quarter times a third, or, you know, and they have to calculate that out or work it out. And for them, depending on, you know, their familiarity, that might be a nice thing to be working on. But I mean more than that when I'm talking about the problem oriented and problem solving. You ideally, what you want is for the child or the adult or the situation is to encounter the problem and in this process construe what the problem is actually about. Okay. So first of all, they encounter a problem, and the problem might be just because something, the way that they expected something to proceed didn't proceed that way. All right. So they had a method for doing something and that method doesn't work for this particular situation. And, you know, which for them might be a surprise. But then they need to look at the situation. Say, well, what's the situation here? I thought it was this, and it isn't, right? And then at that point, you're starting to have to construe or look at the situation differently. So it's not just about calculation. It's about a whole orientation to the situation. Okay.
Helpful.
Yeah. Now, Davydov uses, I think the first example that Davydov uses, or the simplest example, would be in he wants to introduce a fundamental idea in his mathematics class. I think he largely focused on the curriculum and on designing the curriculum and facilitating the whole process. He had other people doing teaching. It wasn't just Davydov doing this. So in a mathematics class with young children, he wants to introduce a foundational concept of quantity. Okay, so now, you know, you think about it, how do you introduce quantity? You could just talk about it, which would be conventional way. But so he sets up some problem-oriented tasks for these young children. Okay. And so this is written about in the book. It's quite straightforward, so it's easy to talk about. He has the children perform some comparisons about the length, perhaps, or the width of certain features of the classroom. Okay. And so one might be the edge of a table, and the other might be, oh, I don't know, something quite long. Maybe someone's got a ruler, or there's, we probably haven't got a ruler there. There's probably be the height of one of the children. And they say, well, which one is longer if you line them up? Yeah. And so the children get used to saying line up things, or a pencil and the book. Okay. Which is longer, and they can get used to certain kinds of comparisons by taking one object and another object and saying, well, okay, you know, the book's higher than the pencil, or simple things. Now, once they're happy with this as a method of answering this question, you could then ask them, say, well, which is longer or wider, the windowsill or the height of the door? Okay. And she'll say, oh, okay, we make this comparison. But once they start to make this comparison, they're going to find that there's a problem, right? Because they can't physically line them up. Right? So now they're starting to experience some contradiction. Teachers told us to measure the door, which is over there or somewhere, and the window over there. How do I measure them up? Okay. And maybe they have a whole lesson on this or something like this. Okay. And of course, so they need to come up with they've encountered a problem. The teacher's given them a problem in which they need to solve that problem. So they need to invent something to solve that problem. Right? And that invention, you know, it could be a piece of string. It could be one of the children walks around with their arms stuck out, this sort of thing. But if you get with a little bit of reflection, you can see, well, what the children are doing is that they are inventing a form of measurement, right? And the basis of measurement is quantification. Okay. So now that experience of resolving that problem is introducing quantification in a different way than just saying, oh, take a ruler and measure this necessarily. Okay. So if you reflect on what's going on here, and if these some of the ideas are new, you need to think about this quite a lot. But I would suggest that very important thing of what is going on here is that they are learning to construe the situation. They're not just taking it as a given, they're learning to construe it. And so there's a number of things that are very important things with respect to the way Davydov approaches things, which are inherent into the example I've given. One is that he started off with this concept of quantity. Okay, now quantity wasn't arbitrarily chosen. He's saying he's introducing mathematics. He's going for very foundational concepts, and so quantity is a very important part that he's starting with. He's effectively taken into account the history of ideas, okay? Because he's looking at what are the conditions under which quantification or measuring something is important. And so he's almost taking, let's take the essence of a situation, of a historical situation, and reintroduce that into the classroom in order to understand it. Oh, by the way, if there's a bit of buzzing in the background, it's because I've got a bit of a noisy computer fan, which is part of the reason why I've got the headphones. So hopefully it's not too annoying.
Yeah, I don't hear it.
Okay,
one other thing that was jumping out to me was let's say you create a piece of string to measure the window and the door. That's a physical, tangible tool. But of course, in other areas of comparison or different types of thinking, these tools become invisible at some point. You have sort of that string eventually is going to become invisible because we could eyeball the window and the door eventually.
Sure. Yeah. Right? If you worked with with those kind of materials, and you worked in sort of a construction or building and that sort of thing, you can visually make skilled assessments about the measurement of things, which otherwise you might not.
So with the string, you're constructing some sort of solution to a problem, and by developing a solution, or at least a way to interact with the problem, you're going to have a much richer grasp of the concept itself than
definitely
if the concept was just sort of presented. We don't have to get into this now, but I was thinking the whole window versus the door thing. Not because they're passageways, but just like what would I'm thinking, what would an adult version of that problem be? Of similar difficulty, because I was thinking that for a lot of reasons, just because people are horrible at comparing things in general. And
right, yeah. Well, comparison is only inherent to this situation, because that's what quantification is. You want to quantify in order you're comparing two things, and quantification facilitates that. But there could be other, if you're introducing if your class was more about technology and design, you could introduce other problems which might involve inventing solutions, which for the children is new. It's personally new for them, but of course historically may have been resolved a long time ago.
Can we say a principle of the developmental education is the teacher taking a lot of effort to figure out sort of constructivist ways of acquiring concepts?
Yeah, it's very, very compatible with constructivism. Yes, certainly.
And then also taking effort to sort of get at the, I guess, to use your term, the history of an idea of a thing, like what is the function of this concept? What sort of uses why did this concept maybe even come into existence, perhaps? Or
yes.
Okay, and so those are two kind of core principles probably of a developmental approach. But I'm sure, what else might I be missing?
Well, if you were trying to characterize it, okay, it's not just what the teacher does, okay? It's how the children respond to it, and what they do is important too. So although you might say it's a good approach to take regardless, I don't want to give the impression that development just happens, okay? I think cognitive reorganization that I refer to is something that requires effort, and that there's a great deal of agency involved in that process. It's something that you sort of take yourself through, and it isn't, you're not just a passive passenger on a journey that someone else is orchestrating. It's like, you could think, it's a facilitation process. So, you know, if you've got unruly kids in a classroom and who are interested in just having, you know, kind of fun in the classroom, and not particularly at this particular juncture, not particularly interested in the subtleties of the material and things, then you've got other issues to deal with, first of all. So in the developmental instruction or teaching, I mean, instructions is translated as instruction, but you've got to be careful with that, of course, because in education, people might think of instruction as a certain kind of teaching method. But basically, with a facet of the developmental approach Davydov is talking about entails a whole different approach to schooling, okay, in which there are different responsibilities placed on the children, different expectations. So, you know, and the parents too, and all, you know, so there's a different ethos.
But still sounds like something one could slip in.
Oh, sure.
To his or her repertoire.
Yeah,
you know, as
definitely,
yet another
definitely.
tool, as yet another tool in the toolbox, or even more.
Yeah,
But,
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Now, you had a question about adult versions.
Oh, yeah, but I think I want to hang on to that for another time.
Okay.
Because I think that'll derail us just a bit. Is there anything about age levels or age crises or that sort of model that is appropriate in terms of where we are in our conversation today?
I don't have a great deal to say about crises on their own, but in the Russian literature, in educational wise, most things start around the age of 6 or even older, because that's when children start going to school, or historically when these papers were written. I mean, it might even be a bit older.
So in that lesson about the window and the door, is there any sort of, could that lesson potentially result in some sort of neoformation, or is that lesson something that can result in one little sort of tiny step forward in the development of some sort of neoformation? Or is that just a wrong question, perhaps?
Well, at a general level, I'd say the whole schooling environment is going to be of the most impressive influence. Here we're talking about, in terms of what has the most significance for the child, these situations. I was saying, well, if they're entering these situations as is planned, and they're not just relying, for example, on their peers to do the problem-solving work, if they're fully engaged in it, then certainly it's very important that this act of construal is, for us, it might seem trivial, but actually can entail work to undertake. Now, there are some examples other examples I might touch upon, perhaps. Okay. In the TRIZ material that I was pulling in for my own kids' education during the lockdown, there are some nice examples to work through on getting the children to work with seeming contradictions. Now, one of these, for example, could be, this is one of my older child. We take up certain features of our landscape and ecology and bring together particular things that might be a bit contradictory, and then work out how they could actually coexist. And so I might create a selection, for example, of things that grow or are conceived as organic, like a tree or an oak tree. Environments, you know, sea, desert, grasslands, mountains, okay. And maybe some other features like animals or other details. Now, we could pick a selection of these and say, okay, let's take an oak tree and a desert, and you are to invent a story about this oak tree that is thriving in the desert. Okay. Now, as an adult, you might look about, oh, okay, you know, okay. Interestingly, with my older child, his first encounter, you know, his expressions when I presented this to him was sort of a rejection. He was saying, well, oak trees won't grow in desert. They can't grow in a desert. You know, it's like, so he has quite a simple, a simple and clear division about what is possible and what isn't possible. And that effectively was the largest stumbling block for him in approaching the problem. So I was making little, you know, I was suggesting particular things, or, you know, suggesting keep working at it. But his first real, I would say, in terms of his expressions, you know, he was sort of thinking about it, or, you know, scrunching up his face and other things and pulling expressions and saying things. But largely, I think the first stumbling block he had was just the resistance he had to the notion that you could have an oak tree growing in a desert. But once I started to you know, allow him to think about it and make a few little suggestions, he started to see that, oh yes, maybe if you had some way of bringing water in, okay, so there was some underground tunnel or channel, and when it rained in a nearby province, the water would trickle through and it would get carried, and part of that tree could get fertilized there. Or maybe there are animals in the desert that get their water elsewhere, and, you know, they happen to like you know, leaving their markings on the tree, right, and water the tree and give it some hydration that way. And this for him was a bit of a surprise. Okay, so it's a different way of thinking. It's like, you might say, he's shifting from a black and white kind of thinking at the time to something bigger. Now, I wouldn't say that it's not just the one occasion that's going to achieve this, but familiarity with that, and to get to a point where you can ask a question that where you don't get this immediate block coming up and say, oh, okay, that seems a bit odd, let me think about that.
But this is kind of how we do things here. Yeah. Like that's,
so that
becomes kind of normal in your environment.
But what you are doing there essentially is your same thing, quite similar to the description I gave for the mathematics class. In certain ways, very similar, in that you are asking the child to find a mediating principle between that resolves a problem, or in the terminology that's often used within dialectics, to resolve the contradiction. Okay, so they're presented with a contradiction to resolve. Now, it's not going to be such a powerful resolution, this story, necessarily, because it's not something that they're tangibly involved in. It's more imaginative. So you might say that a hands-on problem has probably, that's got things going for it that you're not going to necessarily have with the just inventing a story. Because of a hands-on problem, one of the interesting things about technology is going from an idea and then actually implementing something that works. Yeah, that's that in itself. If you can get used to that way of thinking, or that skill to think that, yeah, I can actually think of something in my head that hasn't been done, or that I don't think has been done, and I can then implement that, and it actually works. Yeah, you think that in itself can be a fascinating thing. And I see you can easily forget these things as an adult, but I see children, and I remember myself about finding joy in doing things like programming, because for that, basically that principle of you have ideas, no matter how simple, about making something, and that you see you can actually get it to work. And so this is going far beyond the empirical education in which you say, oh, well, you have to learn these systems, these notations. Okay, here what we're talking about is saying why these notations are labels upon things, and they work in particular ways, but we want to start getting much more into what is it that these notations are about. Why would how are we construing the things that these notations are about? And by doing the problem-oriented approach, you start to get a rich understanding of that. Hopefully,
Yeah,
that's clear.
no, very interesting and helpful, very much. And I have a couple programmer questions, but
Okay.
but first, what you were saying was kind of reminding me of one of my mentors, Michael Smith, has done some work with the concept of flow, and so Csikszentmihalyi has talked about video games as one example of really getting somebody into a flow state for a number of different characteristics, including like quick feedback, incremental difficulties, all sorts of engagement, and other things. And so Michael Smith and some of his partners have tried to design education to capitalize on that state. And so my question for you is there anything in your programming experience, and just listening to you talk about it, you could see how it becomes addictive, this concept of like, oh, I'm going to try to figure something out and see if I could pull it off. And then I pull it off, and what a good feeling. Is there anything from the programming domain that you could use that one could use as a teacher in instructional design, or maybe practice or something like that?
How I would relate to flow in the things I've talked about is about the subtle way that one is using one's imagination, in that you're not you're not you're not you're not trying to control things. in the sense that if you're just in a conventional task where you might manipulate something in order to achieve what you want, it's not like a tool. When imagination with problem solving is, once you get into it, is a lot more subtle, and it's sort of like teasing things out or allowing ideas to come forth. And so what I would talk about in this sense, the flow sense, is it's about gaining insights into problems, which this is I would say it is a key part of a developmental approach to things, is getting access to that. And so you become aware of the nuances of the problem. Now, the way that a productive, and I would say a reasonable way of approaching this, the way I would say historically I found it that works, is that when you have a problem, you work at it and you keep working at it until you don't even have to have the problem before you, in front of you, okay, to be able to think about it and to navigate the issues in the problem. So you gain a very good familiarity with the problem. But once you understand, understanding is the wrong word. Once you have a very good familiarity with that problem, you can then just play with it, and just ignore it, and you'll find that if it's a problem of interest, then ideas will start to connect up for you. Perhaps you start to see things, and that in itself, I suppose, I'm not sure I call it addictive, but it's rewarding to be able to gain insights into things and to enjoy those insights. So there's that aspect of it, which I'd find. I'm not sure. I mean, programming sense, yeah, as someone, you're just doing it for fun, then yes, there is that side to it. I would say that there's another side. There's an aspect of the programming which I was referring to before, which I wouldn't necessarily relate to that flow state with imagination, but I still think it's an important point. Is this point about you are having an idea, and that you can then implement that idea and actually see it work. It's not just you're not just writing a fanciful story, which I'm not, that in itself is a nice thing. And you might say that a fanciful story works if other people enjoy it, right? But in the sense that you can explore a problem domain, okay, that isn't actually you haven't actually necessarily encountered it yet. You know the nature of the problem, and you can think about it independently, and that's I think that's a powerful skill to acquire and use, and yeah, you can appreciate certain things from it. Sure.
Yeah. I just have a article or book title in my head, like The Programmer's Guide to Teaching or something like that, because not necessarily for right now, but just programmer principles that design principles, perhaps.
Oh gosh, yeah, systems ideas and things. Yeah. There's some in programming for sure. One of the difficulties with these things, of course, is when they get sort of taken the wrong way, or they get reified, where people think, oh, programming is good, or or someone say, oh no, don't want to do that. And we're not talking about anything of these nature. It's not about the programming per se. It's just happens to be that the way we think about the programming exemplifies a particular aspect of the activity that we value. Yeah, so you don't want to get, I'm not saying people can get caught up on saying, oh, Huw is talking about programming, which I haven't done in a long time, but I wouldn't say it's not about that. It's about the again this invention aspect, which I would say important.
I did want to hear a little bit about TRIZ, T-R-I-Z.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind
Okay.
taking maybe a handful of minutes to? Seems like a pretty cool idea, but I don't know anything about it.
Okay.
So.
Well, it's the basics of TRIZ. I think you can get on the internet. You can look them up, but it's Russian in origin. It's a chap called, I wrote his name down. Now, I'm not sure you pronounce this. Genrich, perhaps. Schiller. And this is a man who was very interested in design and very influential in this space. And he basically invented TRIZ. So he was so interested in design and making things an innovation that he ended up effectively coming up with an algorithm or a strategy or different ways to facilitate the invention process. And he ended up basically establishing practices. It's like a specialist schools of design where you to look at designing innovative usually apparatus. So TRIZ itself, it's Russian, but the acronym something like Theory of Resolution of Invented tasks or something like that. But the TRIZ bit itself originates from it's an acronym that originates from a Russian terms. Central to TRIZ is the categorization of problems, looking at dimensions of problems, and looking at the interaction between those dimensions to solve things. And if you're interested in design and that sort of thing, it's a great thing to look at. I mean, you could look at, for example, memorable things, for example, will be looking at how would you design a ship to help to cut channels in frozen sea ice. Yeah, so there's certain countries like Scandinavian countries, and I suppose you could apply the same to Canada and North America, that certain times of the year your lakes are going to freeze over. And for example, so ideally you want to be able to cut channels so that your ships can move around. Okay, so you want to design some kind of apparatus that's going to cut these big channels in the ice. There's different ways you can do that. So once you could sort of look at the problem, and again through your construal of the problem, which is very important, you can pick out certain kinds of qualities to the problem that will be useful. So you want certain things. Again, you could think about, well, we could melt the ice, but you'd need a large amount of heat to do that. Maybe we can, if we can cut the ice, so you could cut out blocks of it, for example. Different ways you can approach it. And I think a good solution, or one that was talked about in this particular approach, was thinking about if you designed a ship that was effectively hollow in the middle but had very strong, robust protrusions from it, you could design the ship so that effectively when it came into the contact with the ice, it would cut into the ice, okay, just through its momentum. And because the ship itself isn't your conventional curve to it, your ship itself is leading with these two edges to it, you can actually cut in an incision and then take out. a chunk of the ice. Do you see?
Mm.
But this design, they could come through, excuse me, through, not through just, arbitrary thinking about ideas, but you try to get there systematically. And that's what TRIZ is about systematically trying to get these ideas. But as an offshoot of this, the actual coming up with the innovations itself, there's obviously a valuation an appreciation, and they value these particular thinking skills. And so there's been people in the TRIZ world who've worked on saying, well, can we foster this within educational practice in order to facilitate this? And so those kind of values are very similar to developmental ones. There's a lot of overlap there. And so that's where things, for example, when I talked about the example of the oak tree in the desert, okay, that's an example that I pulled out of a TRIZ teaching guide. Because what you are doing is identifying particular dimensions. You're saying, well, the tree needs water. We don't think of deserts as being particularly blessed with water. So this is somehow I need to think about this situation such that water is present. Okay. And so this is like a little example that like baby TRIZ, you're just trying to, work out a situation in which this might work. Now taking that into mind, where the implementation side of things comes, where the programming part comes in relation to this, is like saying, it's almost like saying, you've come up with the story about water, and now you're going to test it. Now you're actually going to build something and see that your idea actually works. Yeah. That, for me, I think when as a child or even for an adult, when you first start doing this, it can be addictive, certainly in the sense that all of a sudden your ideas are starting to take on a different kind of quality. They're starting to take on, it's almost like your ideas are more real, right? In a certain sense, are more real than what you previously took them for. It's not just fantasy. You can come up with ideas in some respects that are harder and tougher than other things. It's like saying in certain respects mathematics is or things that have a value of proof to them have a kind of rigor and toughness to them. And I don't mean hard here by meaning difficult to understand. It's more like you can't brush them off, right? They have some, in that sense of you can't brush them off. You're coming into contact with the kind of reality which you wouldn't otherwise come into contact with. Otherwise, if you're taking the empirical approach to education, if you're just given rules about how to deal things with work, it's to a certain extent you haven't actually touched or come into proper contact with reality in that sense. Do you see what I mean? You say you haven't really there's something important about the world that you haven't come into contact with. Everything is more second-hand, right? And I would say that's the conventional way. Most, you think we're surrounded by artifacts that we didn't invent. You're speaking a language that you didn't invent, all right? Everything is coming at you to a certain extent second-hand. So you're learning this second-handness. And if you're not careful, you could end up just assuming that that's the way it is. But if you get some authority, even if it's personally new to you and just historically very familiar, that is still a certain kind of authority on a different way of orienting to culture and things in the world, where you can start to look at it and say, how was this invented? Why do we have this thing? Right? So yeah, I think in that sense, yeah.
And you could almost look at it from somewhat in a very small sense from an insider perspective, being an inventor yourself, somebody, or at least somebody who's familiar with some sort of process of invention. Then you can you could look at invention widely and say, okay, I get it. I could appreciate that a little more.
Right, right. I think if you do it enough, then you can start to appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, everyone invents to a certain degree. You know, they're making, you know, this, whether it's just for personal comfort. All right, you just.
I want to ask you a
some sort of
question
social-
about. It might be about TRIZ, but it might just be about this discussion more generally. So let's say this is a circle with a pie chart, and there are. I'm thinking there's probably 3 slices, but maybe there are more. One of which is a construal, but in my head I hear that it's framing, like trying to frame a certain problem in a certain way.
Okay.
And then one is maybe the dimensions of the problem, and then maybe the third is maybe the interaction of those dimensions, and
the interaction of the
maybe the interaction of those dimensions, or different ways those dimensions can interact. I think that's what I heard you say about. So how big would the framing slice be? 30%, 50%, 70%?
Well, I wouldn't. For me, they're the same thing effectively. The construing the dimension. I mean, you could say maybe you could split them if you wanted to. If you wanted to separate the dimensions to the construal, because perhaps one of the reasons I use construal and not framing is that construal isn't just about the whole context. Construal can be about an object, right? So when I was talking about, you know, overly familiar things like furniture, and them as objects, we choose to conceive them as separate objects, right? And we choose to conceive them as bits of furniture. But they don't have to be. We just choose. It's just, but it's so familiar to us. But once you're in an unfamiliar domain, or you've got a problem you're working with, and you start to get used to construing things in particular, then you have questions like, why is it useful to see this thing in this particular way? So you could say, okay, so if you were going to distinguish the object, or the object from dimensions about the object, it would be in your starting position, in the sense you're saying, why is this notional object useful? Why am I thinking this as a discrete thing to begin with? And at that point it's different. But once you start thinking about the object as a problem, or a solution to a problem, then you're starting to think about what qualities that object has. In fact, you could say that the qualities construe the problem itself. I mean, this is what formal logic gets into. Once you've got kids who, or adults familiar with formal logic, which is, I would say, that's the dominant mode of representation in our professions across the board, is using formal logic. If you look at anything reasonably technical, if it's accounting or computing, you can say something is defined by a certain list of requirements that are presented in according to formal logic, and that's the conventional way of construing things. And the formal logic basically consists of attributes, and you say this. So, for example, a square, we say, well, a square, or a square, we might say, is actually a special kind of rectangle. Okay, so a rectangle, we say, well, we might point at various instances of it, for example, but we basically say it's got a length and a width, and they don't have to agree. All right, but basically, if you were trying to list the basic requirements for a rectangle, they would involve attributes of width and length. Yeah.
It's a finite.
So they're just a set of attributes, and you can look at these as measurements of a certain. I mean, if you wanted to come up with if you wanted to say this, I've got a rectangle of this form, you would need to measure it. Okay. So if I said, okay,
if you wanted to shift logics, maybe from formal to like dialectical logic, for example, then approach that object. Yeah. And what does that open up for you?
All right, so that's quite different. So, well, let me just finish the rectangle example. No, but I'll get on to it quick. So, in formal logic, as far as you might go generally is, and this, well, there's some people might say this isn't strictly formal logic, but if I'm talking about the way people use formal logic, okay, then what will you might extend this by saying, okay, we can also have a square, and a square is a kind of rectangle, but it's a special kind of rectangle in that the length and the width have to be the same. So if you have a rectangle where the width, you might have a rectangle sort of that shape, right? But if you so happen to shape the rectangle that shape, then you say, aha, once you hit that magic point, now it's a square. And you carry on, it's a rectangle, but you bring it out again, it's a square, okay? So at a certain point, your rectangle did that actually appear on the, I don't know, maybe I was raised it too high. At that point, it's a rectangle, that point, it's a square. Okay, whatever. Right. To give us another very simple, probably too simple example, if we're thinking about things in terms of, you could say dialectical, I probably prefer to say genetic logic, okay? But you can say dialectical. The dialectical, there's lots of different variants towards it. You can almost say there's a politics of dialectical description. But
developmental?
Well, we'll be fine. Well, I think we know what we're talking about, the genetic or dialectical logic reference to it. It's perhaps easiest to draw attention to the difference by just comparing the two. So with formal logic and the habits of formal logic, we wouldn't generally think of an acorn as being the same as a tree, right? Or an acorn in its environment and a tree in its environment, okay? Although we say, yes, the acorn comes from the tree, conventionally, if we're construing these objects as discrete things with attributes, you're saying, well, the acorn doesn't look anything like a tree. It hasn't got leaves on it. It's tiny and the tree is huge, yeah? The acorn has limited uses. I mean, if we're hungry, maybe we can cook it or eat it or something, and you know, it might be pretty, and we put it on the windowsill. But it's different to the tree, okay? But now, if we look at things from a developmental perspective, okay, i.e. how things come into being, okay, then we could say, well, the key difference between an acorn in its environment and an oak tree is the quality of growth, state of growth. You could compare them and say, you could think of it basically as being, they are potentially the same with respect to a particular kind of unit, a particular way of looking at it. And so when people are talking about units of analysis, and Vygotsky gets into this, when he talks about finding a unit of analysis of bringing speech and thought together, okay, then this becomes a useful, appropriate distinction. There is another key distinction here that's probably worth referring to, and this goes back to Ilenkov's work, where I think he was certainly in terms of the Russian cultural history, he was very influential in clarifying some of these ideas using technical language. And so he came up with clear articulated, I mean, not easy to read, but much more clearly articulated distinctions about, for example, different notions of general, or what we call general. So typically in formal logic, we distinguish between instances of things and classes of things. Yeah. So we might have an idea of a car type. Okay, type of car. manufacture a model, or even perhaps a blueprint for a particular car or idea. And then we can say, well, that type of a car is different to instances of the car. Example, people that actually people own and drive and we see on the roads. So you could say that's those conventions are typical of formal logic and that way of thinking, in that we have this blueprint of a type and we have instances of it. So the class and the type are two very different things, and they only interact in terms of our thinking about it. From Ilyenkov's contribution, or one of his contributions, was clarifying a different version of generalization in which what is general is not necessarily distinct from the instances. What is focused on is the particular, and this would be the particular qualities or processes that can unfold into many different things. So it's sort of identifying real things that have a quality, have a seed-like quality to them, which can unfold into many different things. Okay, so that's a very different way of conceiving the world of objects. Okay, it's still, you're still involved with the practicalities of all these things, but it's looking at it in a different way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you got to my question, which was initially about rectangles, which was like, because my question was kind of, what is, if you shifted perspectives or shifted frames or shifted paradigms to look at a square and a rectangle, how can that help you creatively? How can that help you see it maybe beyond just the finite list of dimensions that might formally describe a rectangle? And that's where you went.
Okay.
And I think I realized fully that you went there when you talked about the seed concept. The thing is also maybe in the process of becoming, or the thing has potential. The thing is not just is.
Yeah, I think in terms of experiences you can access within a classroom setting, I think when I talked about first-hand experience of certain aspects of the world, I think that's probably very important, and that's probably what you might have been referring to when you're talking about programming potentially being addictive and what have you. I think that's basically at the root of it, or it would be in my own experience, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think one of the themes of this conversation was problem creation and problem solving, or problem-construal, and
Yes.
and also I'll add a few other things. The question, what is going on here, where you take that question seriously. So some of the things that I would selfishly was trying to pull out, and I have, and I will even more so when I rewatch this a couple of times, is problem solving strategies, problem creation strategies, invention strategies, and I would say that was probably the central, and then also ways of framing and or construing things. Those are
I think
very practical for me. Very practical. Very.
The construing probably deserves greater emphasis than problem solving necessarily. I think there's perhaps it would be easy to take the connotations of problem solving and think that, oh, this is all very much about hands-on technology facets. But you have to remember that I'm talking about the history of ideas, And so it doesn't necessarily have to be technical. It's just I have that to hand. For me, it's quite familiar to talk about. It would be, I mean, we haven't touched at all much more about, or like, what role emotion plays in all of this, what role teamwork and dialogue play in this, but all of this has a role. Yeah, I mean, in the theorizing that I've worked on, it fits very much within the structure or architecture that I think is useful. Basically, looking at saying that as with Vygotsky talks about the social genesis of mind, you can look at saying, well, what is taking place within one person's mind, you can distribute. And in fact, in many situations of problem solving, the distribution can be very helpful in a classroom setting, because once you get into the if you look into these kind of experiences and think about, why is this difficult for these particular learners? What so difficult being good in this sense, why is this challenging? And one of the challenging things about these activities, whether they're hands-on or imaginary, is that they entail coordination of things that the agents don't have too much familiarity with. Okay, but it's basically, if you think about it, sentence, well, if you're dealing with a complex, or experientially a complex set of ideas, then if you're doing it as a team or working together, then you can have different people focusing on particular aspects of it and working together. So as you have in a teaching situation, you have available to you the ideas about that you're facilitating. You are actually helping to coordinate things for the child. You're holding things in place to a certain degree to allow the child to work with them. As a group of children, then you could say, well, yeah, in a distributed sense, they can help hold the problem together. Not only in a sense of the intricacies of the problem or the idea, the intricacies of the idea, all the facets of the idea, but emotionally, in terms of interest, everything, like the liveliness of it. So, what I haven't talked about, it might sound quite a dry thing, what we're talking about here, but experientially for the children, you would say, we're looking at fostering a very exciting place that you look forward to doing, because once you get used to it, you think, yeah, I love that stuff. I want to get into it. So, and I don't think you don't need to. It's just that technology is quite an easy way to explain it. But there's absolutely no reason why you can't take these ideas in the setting of English and other areas too. And Davydov and his colleagues, talk about learning aspects of English in a developmental context as well. So that would probably be useful as well for you to look at.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah,
very cool. Very, very lots of rich material.
I know.
Personally, for me to work with here. And
once you start unfolding it, there is a lot to it. But I think
no doubt.
you can see that when I started to talk about Davydov, I said the whole thing can collapse down into quite a very small but very powerful set of ideas. About this history of ideas that's fostering orientation, that refers to the foundations of the subject, and is ideally it's something that can unfold into the content of at least a subtopic of your domain of interest. So it's highly concentrated. It's like the idea itself. This is why people use the analogy of things like germ cell, is that it's like you've taken a large, well, a domain of whatever domain you're interested in, and somehow you've identified features of it which will collapse down into some seed-like quality, and then you're effectively trying to pass this over and allowing it to bloom experientially. And that's, I know you said one of the things you wanted to look at was, for example, differences between notational learning and development. Now, does that start to fit in with you?
Very much.
If you're just, notation can be, it's a skill, and it's one that in our culture is valued, but it's problematic, I think, if we just learn the system of notation and don't exercise any work upon what the notation is actually about. If we just take it as given, then we're not really breaking into it. We're just secondhand users of these ideas. And again, with developmental education, a core facet of it is gaining mastery of your own learning process. And so this naturally entails a growing appreciation of what it means to know what knowledge is. Okay, so yeah, in some respects, you want to introduce philosophy because it should be part of, philosophy is about ways of knowing and understanding. As far as I'm concerned, that should be the core of schooling, and you shouldn't reserve it for ostensibly for some adults to entertain in an abstract way. It should be lived. So.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Hold on, please, 1 sec. Okay.
Sure.
Hey, thank you. I had to talk to my kids. I have to make them lunch in a couple minutes.
Fortunately, my wife's on duty today, so
nice.
So I can I cook on the weekends and occasionally during the week.
Very nice. Yeah. And my wife is a professional cook, so I'm pretty lucky.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why my cheeks are so full. But I have so I only have time for maybe one question, possibly two, and I'm gonna give you the choice. So choice number one is there anything that we really didn't get into today that you think is urgent enough or interesting enough, or maybe even just playful or fun enough that you want to add? And the other question is, I like the oak tree in the desert story. Like, combine that with narrative. I like that. And if somebody wanted to create problems that are engaging, generative, maybe even seed-like in some sense, or germ-like in some sense, do you have any advice for problem creators? Especially in a developmental or educational sense.
Well,
those were my two questions. Feel free to take either one.
Well, yeah, there's very exciting material that I've been engaged in for the last 2 or 3 years that goes beyond Vygotsky and Davydov, but it's true to the whole Davydov and Vygotsky in sense of my saying that adult development continues. So I've had certain experiences out of the box and blue sky, the things that I wasn't expecting in my own experience, and that have sort of widened my horizons. So I haven't really looked too much at, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the problems that I was interested in, concepts I was interested in, and the readings of Vygotsky, I'm no longer such an active reader of Vygotsky. It's like I feel I have good understanding of what Vygotsky was doing, and I read occasionally in that space. So in the systems literature, I read quite a bit and look into it, but my interests are sort of research interests have taken another step, if you like, in that space, and that partially pertains to things like to logic and forms of reasoning. So I'm quite interested in triadic logic, or what you might call ternary logic, and that's one of the things I'm looking at. But it also feeds into aspects of mysticism and all sorts of profound things that I didn't really think that I was going to encounter in my ways of going about things. So those are some of the things that I've been focusing more upon recently, and seem to me to be very important things to look at. Second question about advice. I think you should trust your own experiences here. I think one of the important things when I was talking about learning, when we're talking about flow and learning, learning to gain some confidence in using imagination and harnessing imagination, so that it's not just arbitrary. You're controlling it to a certain extent in saying what the shape of a problem. So you're having some discipline with your imagination, but it's still imaginative work. And there's lots of literature being written about play and imagination, and this you can look at as an extension of that. I think you should trust your personal experience to a certain degree. So I imagine it would be rather difficult for someone to apply and appreciate to a certain amount what I'm talking about if they don't value that innovation and philosophical thinking themselves. But I don't think I'm talking to a minority here necessarily. I think lots of people, once they start to dig into it, think, there are moments in which you can value things more than just a ritual you need to go through to learn particular rules, and you start to say, I can see the importance in better understanding. So there's an interesting in addition to becoming confident with the use of imagination, there's a certain kind of trust, I suppose, you can have with the situation. It's like confidence. You gain confidence of something, and you know that it works. So there's a kind of you gain a strengthening familiarity with that you can come up with interesting ideas or understand why ideas why ideas are described in particular ways, why they articulate particular structures. So personal experience. I think if you were doing it to start with, if you'd never consciously done this sort of thing before, you could have quite a few false starts, in that things might not go smoothly as you originally planned. So you probably want to best start off with things that are quite familiar to you. The domain space is quite familiar. But I think really it's a cultural notion as well. Children come into, if it's talking about a formal teaching session, children, even in primary school, they start coming to school with expectations about what schooling is about. Or even in other contexts. For example, when I've helped out, I've helped out with cubs here. Do you know about cubs? So I help out with like boys go to Cubs, or at least one does, old enough to Cubs, and I have situations there of making things, and when I'm helping out, sometimes I'll say to some of the children, well, have a think about it, try and work out how to do it, because they're asking me, they want it. And some of the children would just flat out say, no, I want you to tell me how to do it, right? And I think this is part of a cultural valuation. It's not necessarily the child. I don't think that it's the child just not being inclined to do this from personal decisions. It's just what they're habituated to. But if you have a classroom setting in which people become more habituated to this idea, then it will become easier. So part of what we call difficulty is not necessarily something inherent to the, I mean, there are difficult tasks that we can do, that there's something complex in the task itself. But some of the times what we call difficulty is just seeing it in a particular way, or being willing and to engage these things. So what from a starting point, what you need is a willing participants. Is what I would say there. When I've referred to complexity quite a bit. It's probably worthwhile clarifying here. It's a distinction that I used to make, still do occasionally, but it's a useful distinction, and that is that there's a difference between complex and complicated. Right? Are you familiar with this distinction? So you can make many things complicated, right? You just jumble things up and make it a bit more of a mess, and it becomes complicated. If you've got a tangle of wool to unravel, then you could say that was complicated. It's just sort of something, once you've tidied it up, then there's nothing left to do. You've pretty much tidying. So you can have complicated ideas, all they entail is tidying things up. But complex is referring to structure that's inherent to ideas. And again, I would have thought that it would make sense for anyone, really, if you're saying that what is the best way to introduce someone to something that is potentially complex, is to engage it actively as a full task, not as an abstract task, but in which you have a qualitative experience of it. No one has you don't have to have this idea written out in paragraphs and read it in a book. If you can experience the idea, then I'd have thought that makes it accessible as well. But it's all the more advantageous if you're entering into these encounters willingly and in a manner that fosters that setting. Because if you've got a disruptive class, then it's not going to work so well, because these kinds of practices entail more self-regulation on the part of the children. Okay, which is why when the correspondence we had with them regards around education and the COVID conditions, one of the takeaway ideas or notions was that it seems to be that remote learning is more conducive to a developmental style of education, because it implies greater self-regulation, because you haven't got someone over your shoulder pointing out what to do all the time, this sort of thing. It implies greater self-regularity in that sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. Speaking of which, self-regulation has
Yeah,
plummeted. And
yeah.
so I lied, and I do have one final quick
Okay.
question. Give
All
me a lunch idea from your part of the world.
A lunch idea.
A
Oh,
lunch
that I make.
idea. Yeah.
That I make. Well, what do you call lunch midday? Because I normally, what we call tea, and that's sort of evening meal or evening meal.
Something smaller than supper.
Oh, all right. Because I normally, it's the supper things I normally do the cooking. I was going to say, a typical one I make is cauliflower cheese. You know, that's quite straightforward.
I have a fresh head of cauliflower. It's called cheddar cauliflower.
Okay.
I got it from the farm yesterday,
Okay.
and I was actually ordered to do something with the cauliflower today. So walk me through that very quickly.
Cauliflower cheese. All right. Okay. Well, let's see the way I would do it. You're talking about maybe just under an hour from start to finish. So put the oven on, get it heating up. You want, what do you want? Milk, flour. Gosh, I'm having to remember things now.
Is this similar to macaroni and cheese, but with cauliflower instead of macaroni?
Yeah, I think so, probably.
Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful. That's gonna be dinner tonight for them and for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Plenty of cheese.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, we make a mean mac and cheese here, so this is cool. I'll try that. I'll try to just sub out the cauliflower.
Works for me.
And I will photograph it and give you the results.
Okay. So we went through. Hopefully, touched upon most of your points that you were hoping to.
I think so. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did, and I always enjoy these things. Sometimes even more so upon a second or third listen, because then my head is clear. You know.
Yeah. I mean, it's a different medium, so you're getting different things out of it. I mean, I think, if you wanted anything rigorous, you'd have to go back to the text. But sometimes it helps. I think you hear someone talking about it, and all the stresses in particular places, and you get a sense of how someone thinks about it. You get extra clues sometimes, don't you? So
yeah, it was really helpful and also enjoyable for me.
Okay.
So it was really nice talking to you and actually connecting face to face. So we'll be in touch.
Well, if you want to come back on any of this, by all means.
Yeah, I can imagine that's going to happen.
It's a big topic. I mean, there's
no doubt.
The sources I'm referring to here. It's quite a lot of reading.
No doubt.
So, yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you, and I'll be in touch within the day.
Okay, you're welcome.
And say hello to your family, please.
Yeah.
Wish them well. And I'm glad you did the other thing, because that's going to be a heck of an artifact for your kids to see that when they're older.
Oh wow.
Think about when they're older and they watch that. That's going to be very cool for them.
Yeah, interesting.
I think, yeah. Unless everything goes haywire between now and then, but that doesn't seem likely. That doesn't seem likely at all.
No. Yeah,
It seems like you have a good thing going, and I'm happy to hear that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, man.
All right. Thanks, Anthony.
We'll talk soon. Thank you.
Okay.
All right,
Yeah.
take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.